The night sky over Rabaul burned with tracer fire. February 1944. Squadron Commander James Hartley gripped the controls of his modified Corsair fighter as anti-aircraft shells burst around him like deadly fireworks. Below, the Japanese stronghold bristled with defenses that had turned back dozens of Allied raids. Every intelligence report confirmed what pilots already knew. The fortress was impenetrable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then came the order. The classified directive that would arrive in sealed envelopes marked with red stamps. The modification that Navy brass had approved in hushed meetings behind closed doors. The weapons system that Japanese commanders had never anticipated, never prepared for, never imagined American ingenuity would dare to deploy. Hartley armed the system. His wingman, Lieutenant Robert Chen, did the same. What happened in the next 40 seconds would rewrite the tactical playbook for naval aviation in the Pacific. The weapon that Imperial Japanese Navy strategists had dismissed as impractical, too complex, too vulnerable, was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. This is the story of how a secret wartime innovation, born from desperation and refined through failure, became the nightmare that Japanese forces could neither predict nor counter. A weapon so effective that enemy pilots would abandon their positions rather than face it. So devastating that Japanese after-action reports would describe it with a mixture of professional respect and barely concealed dread. The Americans had brought something new to the Pacific. Something their enemy hadn't seen coming. And by the time Japanese high command understood what they were facing, it was already too late. The seeds of this revolution were planted not in victory, but in humiliation. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese strike force had achieved what many military analysts thought impossible. They'd crossed thousands of miles of open ocean undetected, launched a devastating surprise attack, and crippled the American Pacific Fleet in a single morning. American naval aviation reeled from the blow. Not just from the tactical defeat, but from the psychological impact of watching Japanese aircraft operate with impunity over American territory. The Mitsubishi Zero fighters that escorted the bombers were unlike anything American pilots had encountered. Lighter, more maneuverable, capable of outturning any fighter in the American inventory. In the months that followed, as America scrambled to respond, Japanese forces rolled across the Pacific with shocking speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore surrendered. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Everywhere Japanese aircraft appeared, they dominated the skies. Their pilots, veterans of years of combat over China, flew with a skill and confidence that rattled even experienced American aviators. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb sat in a debriefing room at Naval Air Station San Diego in March 1942, listening to pilots who'd survived the early battles describe their experiences. The stories were consistent and disturbing. American fighters couldn't match the Zero's agility. Diving away was often the only escape. Engaging in a turning fight was suicide. Webb had spent his career studying aerial tactics. He'd flown biplanes in the 30s, observed European air combat developments, written papers on fighter doctrine that most of his superiors had ignored. Now those same superiors were desperate for answers. The Navy needed solutions, and they needed them immediately. The prevailing wisdom said American fighters needed to be lighter, more maneuverable, able to dogfight the Zero on equal terms. Webb disagreed. He'd been arguing for years that the future of air combat lay not in maneuverability but in firepower, speed, and tactical flexibility. His ideas had been dismissed as theoretical, unproven, the musings of a staff officer who didn't understand real combat. The disaster at Pearl Harbor changed everything. Suddenly, unconventional ideas were welcome. Theories that had gathered dust in filing cabinets were being revisited. And Webb's proposal, the one that had been rejected 3 times before the war, was pulled from the archives and given a second look. The concept was radical. Instead of trying to outmaneuver Japanese fighters, American aircraft would carry a weapons system so devastating that maneuverability became secondary. The system would allow pilots to engage multiple targets simultaneously, saturate defensive positions with overwhelming firepower, and break off attacks before enemy fighters could respond. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the proposal with skepticism. The system Webb described would require significant modifications to existing aircraft. It would add weight, complexity, and potential points of failure. Engineers worried about structural integrity. Logistics officers fretted about ammunition supply chains. Conservative admirals questioned whether the gains justified the risks. But Admiral William Halsey, commander of carrier forces in the Pacific, saw potential. Halsey had no patience for conventional thinking. He'd watched Japanese aircraft savage his fleet. He'd seen American pilots die because their tactics and equipment couldn't match the enemy. If Webb's system offered even a chance of turning the tide, Halsey wanted it tested. The authorization came through in April 1942. Project Thunderbolt, classified at the highest levels. A handful of aircraft would be modified to test Webb's concept. If the trials succeeded, production would expand. If they failed, the project would be quietly cancelled and its proponents reassigned to less critical duties. Webb assembled a team at Naval Air Station Alameda. Engineers from Grumman and Vought, ordnance specialists from the Bureau of Weapons, pilots willing to test unproven systems in combat conditions. The work proceeded in isolated hangars, away from curious eyes. Even most base personnel had no idea what was being developed behind those locked doors. The weapon system itself was deceptively simple in concept but nightmarishly complex in execution. Multiple forward-firing rockets mounted in wing pods, each capable of independent targeting through a revolutionary fire control system. The pilot would acquire targets through an enhanced gun sight, designate priorities, and release salvos that could engage several enemy aircraft or ground positions simultaneously. Japanese intelligence had no knowledge of the project. Their agents in California, mostly neutralized after Pearl Harbor, couldn't penetrate the security around Alameda. Diplomatic cables from neutral nations mentioned increased American aircraft production but nothing about new weapons systems. Japanese naval planners, analyzing American capabilities, saw no indication that anything had fundamentally changed. This blind spot would prove fatal. Japanese tactical doctrine assumed American pilots would continue fighting the way they'd fought in early 1942. Predictable attack patterns, limited firepower, reluctance to press home attacks against heavy defenses. Japanese gunners trained to engage single aircraft approaching from standard vectors. Japanese pilots learned to exploit American fighters' poor turning ability. None of their training prepared them for what was coming. The first modified Corsair rolled out of the Alameda hangar in June 1942. The aircraft looked nearly identical to standard production models, but anyone examining it closely would notice the bulges under the wings. 8 rocket tubes per side, 16 total, each loaded with a 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket. The fire control system connected to a modified gun sight that allowed the pilot to designate up to 4 targets and engage them in rapid sequence. Test flights revealed immediate problems. The added weight affected handling characteristics. The rocket exhaust scarred the wing surfaces. The electrical fire control system suffered from interference. Several test launches resulted in rockets detonating prematurely or failing to ignite at all. Engineers worked around the clock fixing issues, redesigning components, strengthening structures. Webb pushed his team relentlessly. Every day the system remained undeployed was another day Japanese forces consolidated their gains. American forces were being pushed back across the Pacific. The Doolittle raid in April had provided a morale boost but no strategic advantage. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May had been tactically inconclusive. American forces needed a game-changing capability, and they needed it before Japanese defenses became impenetrable. By August 1942, 6 aircraft had been modified and certified for combat trials. The Navy selected experienced pilots, men who understood that they'd be testing proven equipment in the most unforgiving environment possible. Lieutenant James Hartley was among them. A veteran of the early Pacific battles, he'd seen friends shot down by Zeros, watched Japanese anti-aircraft fire tear bombers apart, developed a personal hatred for the enemy that burned with cold intent.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Hartley listened to Webb's briefing with growing excitement. The system would allow him to engage multiple targets before enemy gunners could track him. He could saturate Japanese positions with rocket fire, breaking their defensive coordination. He could attack and escape before enemy fighters reached intercept positions. The tactical possibilities seemed endless. The modified Corsairs deployed to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in September 1942. The island was still contested, with Japanese forces controlling much of the interior and launching regular attacks against the American perimeter. Air raids were constant. Every pilot flying from Henderson knew they were operating on borrowed time, that Japanese bombers could crater the runway at any moment. Hartley and his squadron conducted their first combat trial on September 15. The target was a Japanese supply convoy approaching Guadalcanal under heavy escort. Standard doctrine called for torpedo bombers to attack the ships while fighters engaged the escorts. Casualties were typically heavy. Torpedo bombers were slow, vulnerable, easy targets for both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Webb's system offered an alternative. The modified Corsairs would make high-speed passes, launching rockets at both the ships and their escorts simultaneously. The attack would be over in seconds, giving Japanese gunners and pilots minimal time to respond. The squadron approached at 20,000 feet, using cloud cover to mask their approach. Japanese spotters on the convoy detected them too late. Hartley rolled into his attack dive, the modified gun sight tracking multiple targets. He designated a destroyer as primary target, a transport as secondary, enabled the fire control system, and squeezed the trigger. 16 rockets launched in sequence over 3 seconds. The Corsair shuddered with each launch, but the structural modifications held. Hartley pulled out of his dive and went to full throttle, racing away from the convoy as his rockets impacted. The destroyer's forward gun mount erupted in flames. The transport took 3 hits along its waterline. Secondary explosions bloomed across both vessels. Behind him, the other 5 Corsairs conducted their own attacks. In less than 30 seconds, the convoy was devastated. 2 destroyers dead in the water, 3 transports burning, a 4th listing badly and starting to settle. Japanese fighters, scrambling to intercept, arrived to find the American aircraft already beyond pursuit range. The after-action report reached Halsey's headquarters within hours. His response was immediate. He wanted every available Corsair modified with the rocket system. He wanted production expanded, training accelerated, doctrine rewritten around the new capability. The Navy had stumbled onto something revolutionary, and Halsey intended to exploit it ruthlessly. Japanese commanders examining the wreckage of the convoy struggled to understand what had happened. Survivors reported American aircraft launching multiple weapons simultaneously, more firepower than they'd ever seen from single fighters. The attacks had been too fast, too coordinated, too devastating for conventional explanations. Initial reports suggested the Americans had deployed a new type of bomber. Japanese intelligence analysts dismissed this. The aircraft matched Corsair profiles. They had to be fighters, but fighters didn't carry that kind of ordnance load. The reports made no sense. This confusion gave American forces a crucial advantage. While Japanese planners debated what they'd encountered, modified Corsairs were already conducting follow-up strikes. Rabaul, the massive Japanese stronghold, became a primary target. The base bristled with anti-aircraft guns, had extensive fighter coverage, and had successfully repelled previous American attacks with heavy losses. Hartley led his squadron against Rabaul in October 1942. The mission called for striking the harbor facilities where Japanese ships resupplied before heading south toward Guadalcanal. Previous attacks had been suicidal. Bombers approaching at predictable altitudes, flying straight and level to ensure accuracy, presenting perfect targets for Japanese gunners. The modified Corsairs changed the equation. They approached at wave-top height, below radar coverage, and pulled up only at the last moment to acquire targets. Hartley designated a fuel depot, an ammunition bunker, and 2 dock transports. His rockets launched, the Corsair banked hard left, and he was racing away toward open ocean before Japanese gunners could traverse their weapons. The fuel depot exploded with enough force to shatter windows a mile away. The ammunition bunker detonated in a chain reaction that destroyed 3 nearby structures. Both transports took direct hits and began settling at their moorings. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Japanese fighters, scrambling from their airfield, found empty sky. Word spread through the Japanese military. American fighters had developed a new attack method, something involving multiple projectiles launched at high speed. Countertactics were developed. Anti-aircraft batteries were instructed to engage earlier, to put up walls of fire that would force American pilots to break off attacks before launching weapons. Fighter patrols were increased, kept at higher readiness, positioned to intercept raiders before they reached their targets. None of it worked. The modified Corsairs were too fast, their attacks too brief. By the time Japanese gunners registered the threat and opened fire, the American aircraft were already escaping. By the time Japanese fighters reached intercept positions, their targets were gone. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Pilots who dominated the early Pacific Air War found themselves unable to engage an enemy that struck and vanished before they could respond. Anti-aircraft gunners, trained to track steady bomber formations, couldn't hit fighters conducting high-speed rocket attacks. Supply officers watched munitions and fuel stocks dwindle as American raids destroyed stockpiles faster than ships could replace them. Japanese high command, receiving increasingly desperate reports from field commanders, demanded answers. What was this weapon? How did it work? Most importantly, how could it be countered? Intelligence officers compiled what information they had. The weapon appeared to be multiple rockets, possibly unguided, launched from modified American fighters. The launch mechanism remained unclear. The targeting system was sophisticated beyond anything Japanese forces had encountered. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, studied the reports with growing concern. Yamamoto had opposed war with America, warning his superiors that industrial capacity and resources would eventually doom Japan. Now he was watching his predictions come true in real time. The Americans were innovating faster than Japanese forces could adapt. In November 1942, Yamamoto issued a directive to all Pacific commands. Any intelligence regarding the American rocket weapon was to be forwarded immediately to Combined Fleet headquarters. Captured equipment was to be secured and transported for analysis. Prisoners with knowledge of the system were to be interrogated thoroughly. Japanese forces needed to understand this threat before it completely negated their defensive advantages. But American security held. No modified Corsairs had been shot down over Japanese-held territory. Pilots flying the rocket-equipped aircraft had strict orders. If forced to ditch or bail out, they were to destroy the fire control system before abandoning the aircraft. If capture seemed imminent, they were to reveal nothing about the weapon's capabilities or operational doctrine. The mystery deepened Japanese anxiety. Some officers theorized the Americans had developed guided rockets, though the technology for such weapons didn't exist. Others suggested proximity-fused warheads, which was closer to the truth but still didn't explain the devastating accuracy. A few speculated that American pilots were being given suicide missions, deliberately crashing their aircraft into targets while firing all weapons. This last theory revealed how thoroughly the weapon had disrupted Japanese understanding of American capabilities. The idea that American pilots, previously characterized as cautious and unwilling to accept heavy casualties, would adopt kamikaze-style tactics seemed implausible. Yet Japanese commanders couldn't otherwise explain the ferocity and effectiveness of the attacks. Production of the modified Corsairs expanded through late 1942 and into 1943. Grumman and Vought established dedicated production lines. The fire control system, refined through combat experience, became more reliable and easier to maintain. Training programs taught new pilots not just how to operate the weapons, but how to think tactically about their capabilities. The doctrine evolved. Early missions had focused on surprise and shock value. Pilots learned to leverage their weapon's psychological impact. They began conducting multiple passes against the same target, something previously considered suicidal against heavy defenses. The first pass would destroy primary targets and scatter defenders. Follow-up passes would exploit the chaos, hitting secondary objectives while Japanese forces were still reacting to the initial strike. Lieutenant Robert Chen, Hartley's wingman, pioneered the tactic of deliberately targeting anti-aircraft positions first. His theory was simple. Silence the guns, and subsequent attacks became exponentially safer. During a raid on Bougainville in January 1943, Chen's squadron systematically destroyed every anti-aircraft battery around the airfield before other American aircraft arrived to bomb the runways. The follow-up bombers encountered no resistance. Not a single aircraft was lost. Japanese forces tried everything to counter the threat. They moved ammunition dumps away from obvious targets, dispersed fuel storage, increased camouflage efforts. They stationed fighters at higher altitudes, hoping to dive on American raiders before they could attack. They experimented with rapid response teams, mobile anti-aircraft guns that could be repositioned quickly. Nothing worked consistently. The modified Corsairs adapted faster than Japanese defenses could evolve. When Japanese forces dispersed their supplies, American pilots simply attacked multiple dispersed targets in a single pass. When Japanese fighters stayed at altitude, American raiders approached at low level and were gone before the interceptors could descend. When mobile guns appeared, they became priority targets for follow-up strikes. By early 1943, Japanese defensive doctrine across the Pacific was in disarray. Commanders who'd spent years developing tactics against conventional air attacks found their expertise useless. The Americans were fighting differently, and Japanese forces had no effective response. The weapon's true nature remained classified even as its effects became undeniable. American press reports mentioned increased air activity in the Pacific but provided no details about new weapons systems. Newsreels showed Corsairs taking off from carriers but were carefully edited to exclude footage of the rocket pods. When journalists asked pilots about their missions, the responses were vague. Heavy action, successful results, can't discuss specifics due to operational security. Japanese propaganda attempted to downplay the threat. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo claimed American pilots were becoming desperate, adopting reckless tactics that would ultimately lead to their destruction. Official statements minimized losses, inflated American casualties, insisted that Japanese forces remained in complete control of the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers fighting on contested islands knew better. They watched American aircraft strike with impunity. They saw their supply lines severed, their reinforcements destroyed at sea, their air cover vanish. The disconnect between propaganda and reality bred cynicism and despair. Admiral Yamamoto, increasingly pessimistic about Japan's prospects, advocated for a negotiated peace. His private correspondence revealed his assessment. Japan had lost the initiative. American industrial production was overwhelming Japanese capacity. New weapons like the rocket-equipped fighters were appearing faster than Japanese forces could develop counters. Continuing the war would lead only to complete destruction. His superiors rejected the advice. The war would continue. Japanese forces would fight with the resources they had, adapting as necessary, trusting in the warrior spirit that had carried them through previous conflicts. Victory remained possible if commanders and soldiers maintained their resolve. Yamamoto died in April 1943 when American fighters, guided by intelligence from broken Japanese codes, intercepted his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The irony wasn't lost on observers. The admiral who'd warned against war with America, who'd recognized American potential before most of his peers, had been killed by American precision and intelligence gathering. His death deprived Japan of one of its most capable strategic thinkers. The officers who replaced him lacked his breadth of vision. They focused on tactical victories, on holding territory, on inflicting casualties, without grasping the larger reality that American industrial might was producing weapons and aircraft faster than Japanese forces could possibly counter them. The modified Corsairs continued their devastating campaign. By mid-1943, nearly 300 had been deployed across the Pacific. They operated from carriers, from island bases, from auxiliary fields carved out of jungle. Wherever they appeared, Japanese defensive positions crumbled. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the weapon's maturity. Japanese carriers, attempting to strike American invasion forces, found themselves under attack from swarms of rocket-equipped fighters. The massive air battle, which would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed. American pilots, including dozens flying modified Corsairs, shot down Japanese aircraft at ratios that seemed impossible. Hartley participated in that battle, his 8th major engagement since deploying the rocket system. He'd personally destroyed or damaged more than 40 Japanese aircraft and innumerable ground targets. He'd been recommended for the Navy Cross twice, receiving it once. He'd trained dozens of younger pilots in the tactics that had kept him alive through 2 years of constant combat. During the Philippine Sea engagement, Hartley's squadron intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers attempting to reach American carriers. The enemy aircraft, lumbering compared to fighters, stood no chance. Hartley designated 4 targets, launched his full rocket complement, and watched all 4 bombers disintegrate in midair. His wingmen achieved similar results. In less than 5 minutes, an entire Japanese bomber squadron ceased to exist. The Japanese pilots who survived that battle returned to their carriers with stories of American fighters that seemed to carry unlimited ammunition, that could engage entire formations simultaneously, that struck with coordinating precision that suggested telepathy or supernatural awareness. These weren't exaggerations born of fear. They were accurate descriptions of what the fire control system and rocket weapons made possible. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the Philippine Sea. The carriers survived, but the aircrews did not. Replacing trained pilots took years, time Japan didn't have. The battle marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the final island battles before a planned invasion of Japan itself, modified Corsairs provided close air support that saved countless American lives. The rocket salvos were perfect for destroying Japanese bunkers, cave positions, and hidden artillery. Pilots could place rockets with enough accuracy to strike targets within 100 yards of friendly troops, something impossible with conventional bombing. Ground commanders requested rocket support specifically. Marines pinned down by Japanese machine gun nests would radio coordinates. Within minutes, Corsairs would appear, launch devastating strikes, and the advance would continue. The psychological boost for American ground forces was enormous. They knew air support would arrive when needed, would be accurate and overwhelming. For Japanese defenders, the weapon represented hopelessness. They couldn't hide from it, couldn't shoot it down consistently, couldn't counter it with their own aircraft. All they could do was endure the strikes, suffer the casualties, and wait for the next attack. The final months of the war saw modified Corsairs flying from Okinawa against targets on the Japanese home islands. They struck ports, railways, industrial facilities, military installations. The rocket attacks complemented the larger strategic bombing campaign, hitting targets too small or too well defended for heavy bombers but too valuable to ignore. Japanese citizens, already suffering from conventional bombing raids and naval blockades, added these rocket attacks to their growing list of catastrophes. Civil defense measures that might have mitigated damage from high-altitude bombing were useless against fast, low-level fighter attacks. Air raid sirens provided minutes of warning at best. By the time citizens reached shelters, the attacks were often over. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the modified Corsairs had flown thousands of combat missions across 3 years. They'd destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft, sunk dozens of ships, demolished countless ground installations. More importantly, they'd accomplished their strategic purpose. They'd neutralized Japanese defensive advantages, given American forces tactical flexibility, and demonstrated American capacity for innovation under pressure. The weapon Japanese commanders had never anticipated, had never prepared to face, had never countered effectively, had helped break their defensive lines across the Pacific. Combined with superior American logistics, industrial production, code breaking, and the determination of American service members, the rocket system had contributed to victory in ways that went far beyond simple statistics. The captured documents told a story Japanese high command didn't want to hear. February 1945. American intelligence officers sifted through papers recovered from a downed Japanese reconnaissance aircraft near Okinawa. Among the routine operational reports and weather observations, they found something extraordinary. A tactical assessment written by a Japanese naval aviation officer who'd survived multiple encounters with the modified Corsairs. The document was clinical, precise, stripped of the propaganda that usually characterized Japanese military reports. It described American rocket attacks with technical accuracy that suggested the author understood exactly what he was facing. More tellingly, it concluded with a recommendation that Japanese commanders abandon fixed defensive positions in favor of mobile warfare, because static defenses simply could not survive concentrated rocket strikes. This represented a fundamental shift in Japanese military thinking. For years, Japanese doctrine had emphasized holding territory at all costs, fortifying positions until they became impregnable, forcing American forces to pay in blood for every yard of ground. Now a field officer was recommending the opposite. Give up the fortresses, stay mobile, avoid presenting concentrated targets that American rocket fighters could destroy. The assessment never reached Japanese high command. The reconnaissance aircraft carrying it had been shot down before delivering its intelligence. The officer who wrote it was dead, his insights lost. Japanese forces would continue fighting from fixed positions, continuing to present exactly the kind of targets the modified Corsairs had been designed to destroy. Lieutenant James Hartley read a translated copy of the document in his ready room aboard the carrier USS Essex. He found himself respecting the unnamed Japanese officer who'd written it. The man had understood the tactical reality, had recognized that Japanese defensive doctrine needed to evolve or face annihilation. That he'd died before his superiors could benefit from his analysis was a tragedy, though one that worked in American favor. Hartley had been flying combat missions for nearly 3 years. He'd seen the Pacific War from Guadalcanal through the Philippines, watched American forces push steadily westward, witnessed Japanese resistance gradually crumble. The rocket system had been central to that success, but Hartley knew it was only one element among many. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. Code breakers were reading enemy communications in real time. Industrial production was churning out ships and aircraft faster than Japan could possibly match. Still, the rocket system had given American pilots an edge that multiplied the effectiveness of everything else. Hartley had flown standard Corsairs before receiving his modified aircraft. The difference was night and day. With conventional armament, attacking heavily defended targets meant accepting casualties, hoping enough aircraft survived to inflict meaningful damage. With the rocket system, those same targets could be saturated with firepower before defenders could respond effectively. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A standard fighter bomber might carry 2 500-pound bombs. Hitting a specific target required flying straight and level, presenting a stable platform for the bombardier, giving enemy gunners an ideal target. Even skilled pilots might achieve only a 20% hit rate against defended positions. The modified Corsair carried 16 rockets. Each could be targeted independently through the fire control system. A pilot could designate 4 different targets and engage all of them in a single pass. The hit rate approached 60% with experienced pilots, and even misses often damaged nearby structures through blast effects and fragmentation. More importantly, the attack profile minimized exposure time. A dive bombing run might expose an aircraft to anti-aircraft fire for 30 to 40 seconds. A rocket attack was over in 5 seconds. The pilot acquired targets, launched weapons, and broke off the attack before most gunners could even traverse their weapons. Japanese anti-aircraft crews, trained to engage conventional bombers, found themselves perpetually behind the action. By the time they spotted incoming Corsairs, identified them as threats, and began firing, the American aircraft were already launching rockets and turning away. The brief engagement window gave gunners perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of effective firing time. Against fast-moving, maneuvering targets, that wasn't enough. Some Japanese batteries adopted a strategy of continuous area fire, putting up walls of explosive shells in zones where they expected American aircraft to appear. This burned through ammunition at unsustainable rates and achieved minimal results. The modified Corsairs simply attacked from different vectors, exploiting gaps in the defensive fire, or waited until ammunition stocks were depleted before pressing their attacks. The psychological dimension extended beyond the immediate combat effects. Japanese soldiers defending positions knew that American rocket attacks could come at any time, from any direction, with minimal warning. This constant uncertainty ground down morale more effectively than casualties alone. Men couldn't rest, couldn't relax, couldn't ever feel truly safe even in supposedly secure rear areas. American intelligence officers conducting prisoner interrogations heard similar stories repeatedly. Japanese soldiers described the terror of hearing Corsair engines, knowing that within seconds rockets would be tearing through their positions. Some admitted to abandoning defensive posts when American aircraft appeared, preferring to face courts-martial rather than certain death from rocket strikes. This wasn't universal. Elite Japanese units maintained discipline under fire, and many ordinary soldiers fought with desperate courage despite the odds. But the aggregate effect was undeniable. Japanese defensive effectiveness degraded steadily as the rocket attacks continued, as casualties mounted, as positions that should have held for weeks fell in days. The island of Iwo Jima provided perhaps the clearest demonstration of the rocket system's impact. Japanese forces had spent months fortifying the island, creating an interlocking network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions. American intelligence estimated that assaulting the island would cost tens of thousands of casualties, possibly requiring months of fighting to secure. The modified Corsairs changed those calculations. For 3 days before the Marine landings, rocket-equipped fighters systematically attacked every identified Japanese position. The strikes weren't random harassment. They were methodical destruction, working through a target list compiled from reconnaissance photographs and signal intercepts. Hartley led his squadron against northern defensive positions on February 17, 1945, 2 days before the invasion. His target list included 6 artillery bunkers, 4 machine gun nests, and 2 ammunition dumps. Standard procedure would have been to attack the artillery first, the most dangerous positions. Hartley reversed the priority. He hit the ammunition dumps first. The results exceeded expectations. The first dump exploded with enough force to trigger a sympathetic detonation in the second dump 300 yards away. The combined explosion destroyed 2 of the artillery bunkers outright and damaged a third badly enough to render it inoperable. Hartley's wingmen finished the job, placing rockets directly into the remaining bunker apertures. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes. When Hartley's squadron departed, 6 bunkers were destroyed or disabled, the ammunition dumps were gone, and 3 of the 4 machine gun positions had been silenced. Japanese defenders who survived reported that the attack had been so fast and so overwhelming that they'd barely had time to take cover before it was over. Multiply that single attack by hundreds conducted over 3 days, and the cumulative effect became catastrophic for Japanese defenders. When Marines stormed ashore on February 19, they faced fierce resistance, but the integrated defensive network Japanese commanders had planned to employ had been shattered by rocket strikes. Artillery positions that should have dominated the beaches had been destroyed. Communication lines had been severed. Ammunition stocks had been depleted. The battle still cost nearly 7,000 American lives. Iwo Jima was defended by fanatics who fought from prepared positions with suicidal determination. But without the preparatory rocket attacks, casualties might have been double or triple that number. Every bunker destroyed before the Marines landed was one less position that had to be taken by infantry assault. Japanese commanders analyzing the Iwo Jima battle reached grim conclusions. American firepower had reached levels that made static defense untenable. No position, no matter how well fortified, could survive sustained rocket attacks. The only viable defensive strategy was mobile warfare, trading space for time, avoiding concentration, making American forces hunt for defenders rather than attacking fixed positions. These conclusions came too late to influence Japanese defensive planning on Okinawa, the next major battle. Japanese forces there repeated the same mistakes, concentrating in prepared positions, creating the exact kind of targets the modified Corsairs had been designed to eliminate. The Okinawa campaign, lasting from April through June 1945, saw the rocket system employed on an unprecedented scale. More than 400 modified Corsairs operated from carriers and captured airfields, conducting thousands of strikes against Japanese positions. The island's complex terrain, with its ridges and caves, should have favored defenders. Instead, the rocket attacks negated much of that advantage. Japanese cave positions that were nearly invulnerable to artillery fire proved susceptible to rockets that could be placed with precision through cave mouths. Ridgeline positions that dominated surrounding territory could be attacked from angles that conventional bombing couldn't achieve. Even the famous Shuri Castle, a massive fortress complex that anchored Japanese defenses, fell partly because rocket strikes disabled its artillery and collapsed sections of its walls. Lieutenant Robert Chen, flying from Henderson Field on Okinawa after its capture, developed specialized tactics for cave warfare. He would approach at wave-top height, pull up sharply to clear the ridgeline, and fire rockets during the brief moment when the cave mouth was visible. The technique required split-second timing and absolute precision, but Chen mastered it through dozens of practice runs before attempting it in combat. His most notable success came on May 12, 1945, against a cave complex near Shuri that was sheltering an estimated battalion of Japanese infantry. Chen's squadron made 3 passes, placing rockets through multiple cave openings. The confined spaces amplified the explosive effects. When Marine engineers entered the caves days later, they found hundreds of Japanese dead, killed not by direct hits but by overpressure and fragmentation effects in the enclosed spaces. The ethical dimensions of such warfare troubled some American pilots and commanders. The rocket system's effectiveness came partly from its ability to inflict casualties on an industrial scale. A single well-placed salvo could kill dozens of enemy soldiers in seconds. Multiply that across hundreds of daily strikes, and the casualty totals became staggering. Hartley wrestled with these questions during quiet moments between missions. He wasn't a particularly introspective person, hadn't joined the Navy to philosophize about the morality of war. But flying missions day after day, watching his rockets tear through enemy positions, seeing the destruction afterward during reconnaissance flights, left impressions that couldn't be ignored. He rationalized it as necessary. Japanese forces had started the war, had committed atrocities across Asia, had shown no inclination toward surrender even when defeat was inevitable. Every Japanese soldier killed by American rockets was one less soldier who might kill American Marines. The arithmetic was cold but undeniable. His job was to protect American lives by destroying enemy forces as efficiently as possible. Most pilots shared similar views. They'd seen too much combat, lost too many friends, witnessed too much Japanese fanaticism to feel guilty about employing overwhelming force. The rocket system was a tool, no more inherently moral or immoral than any other weapon. What mattered was ending the war as quickly as possible with minimum American casualties. Japanese military leaders, watching their defensive positions systematically destroyed, faced an impossible choice. They could continue fighting from fixed positions and accept annihilation by rocket strikes. They could adopt mobile warfare and sacrifice the territorial control that was the only measure by which they could claim success. Or they could surrender and accept the national humiliation that would follow. The third option was unthinkable for most Japanese commanders. Surrender meant acknowledging that the warrior spirit, the Bushido code that supposedly made Japanese forces superior, had been insufficient. It meant admitting that American material superiority had overcome Japanese determination. It meant facing their emperor and their people with the news of total defeat. So they fought on, ordering soldiers to defend positions that couldn't be defended, launching attacks that couldn't succeed, sacrificing lives to maintain the fiction that resistance was meaningful. The rocket attacks continued, the casualties mounted, and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. By July 1945, modified Corsairs were flying from Okinawa against targets on the Japanese home islands. They struck coastal installations, railway bridges, small ports, anything within their range that supported the Japanese war effort. These missions were different from earlier campaigns. The targets were often civilian infrastructure that had military applications. The line between military and civilian targets blurred. American planners preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, estimated that the rocket-equipped Corsairs would be crucial for suppressing Japanese defenses during the beach assaults. Intelligence suggested Japan was fortifying every possible landing site, preparing to employ every aircraft, every weapon, every able-bodied person to resist the invasion. The rocket strikes would need to achieve unprecedented levels of destruction to make the landings survivable. Those plans became moot on August 6 and 9 when atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, ending the Pacific War without the massive invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives on both sides. The modified Corsairs had contributed to that victory in ways that went beyond simple statistics of targets destroyed and casualties inflicted. They demonstrated American capacity for rapid innovation, for adapting equipment and tactics to overcome enemy advantages. They'd given American pilots confidence that they possessed superior capabilities, boosting morale throughout the Pacific theater. They'd forced Japanese defenders to operate under constant threat, degrading their effectiveness even when not under direct attack. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, the officer who'd championed the rocket system from its inception, received the Legion of Merit for his contributions to the war effort. The citation praised his vision, his technical expertise, and his persistence in advocating for unconventional solutions to tactical problems. Webb accepted the award with mixed feelings. He was proud of what the system had achieved, but he couldn't ignore the human cost on both sides. In post-war interviews, Webb emphasized that the rocket system's success came from integrated thinking rather than isolated technical innovation. The weapon itself was relatively simple, just rockets and a fire control system. What made it revolutionary was how it changed tactical doctrine, how it allowed pilots to fight differently, how it exploited Japanese defensive weaknesses. This lesson influenced post-war American military development. The services became more receptive to unconventional ideas, more willing to experiment with new technologies, more focused on systems integration rather than individual weapon performance. The Cold War arms race that followed World War II saw American forces consistently innovating, often staying ahead of Soviet developments through exactly the kind of integrated thinking that had produced the rocket system. Japanese military analysts, examining their defeat during the occupation years, acknowledged the rocket-equipped Corsairs as a significant factor in American tactical superiority. Post-war publications discussed how Japanese forces had failed to adapt to the threat, how rigid doctrine had prevented effective responses, how the weapon had exploited fundamental weaknesses in Japanese defensive planning. Some former Japanese officers argued that their forces could have countered the rockets with different tactics. More dispersed positions, better camouflage, mobile reserves that could relocate after attacks. These arguments missed the point. By the time the rocket system appeared in significant numbers, Japan lacked the resources, the training capacity, and the tactical flexibility to implement such changes even if commanders had recognized their necessity. The modified Corsairs were just one element in a broader American advantage. Superior logistics ensured American forces never lacked ammunition or fuel. Code breaking meant American commanders knew Japanese plans before they were executed. Submarine warfare strangled Japanese supply lines. Strategic bombing destroyed industrial capacity. The atomic bombs provided a final, terrible demonstration of American technological superiority. But within that larger context, the rocket system had played its role. It had given American tactical aviation a capability that Japanese forces couldn't match or counter. It had saved American lives by destroying enemy positions with minimal risk to attacking aircraft. It had demonstrated that innovative thinking could overcome enemy advantages in experience and tactical skill. James Hartley survived the war with 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 Navy crosses, and a Purple Heart from a mission where anti-aircraft fire damaged his aircraft badly enough to require a crash landing on Okinawa. He'd flown more than 200 combat missions, destroyed or damaged more than 60 confirmed targets, and mentored dozens of younger pilots who went on to distinguished careers. After the war, Hartley left active duty but remained in the Naval Reserve. He attended college on the GI Bill, earned an engineering degree, and worked in the aerospace industry designing fire control systems for the next generation of military aircraft. His experience with the rocket system informed his professional work. He understood viscerally how weapon systems needed to integrate with pilot capabilities, how complexity could undermine reliability, how innovation required balancing theoretical performance against practical field conditions. Robert Chen followed a different path. He stayed in the Navy, making it a career, eventually retiring as a captain after serving in Korea and Vietnam. He commanded carrier air wings, trained new generations of naval aviators, and wrote tactical manuals that incorporated lessons learned from his Pacific War experience. His insights about precision strike warfare influenced American tactical aviation doctrine for decades. The modified Corsairs themselves had brief post-war service. Some remained in inventory through the late 1940s, used primarily for training and evaluation purposes. The rocket pods and fire control systems were removed from most aircraft as newer technology emerged. A few examples were preserved in museums, their rocket pods reinstalled to show visitors what the aircraft had looked like in combat configuration. Veterans who'd flown the modified Corsairs spoke about them with pride mixed with pragmatism. The aircraft hadn't been perfect. The rocket system added maintenance requirements, reduced fuel capacity, and occasionally malfunctioned. But when it worked, when conditions were right, when pilots employed it correctly, it was devastating. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.